Have you ever wondered what your desktop icons would look like if they were animated? Well, I'm a 3D artist, so I decided to find out. How hard could it be, right? The first logo I picked for this little experiment is Steam. To start out making the Steam logo, I had to start with the original icon. So I grabbed the icon out of Steam just using the inspect feature on my laptop and brought the icon into Blender as a reference. And you can do that by going to Add and Image. And if you select reference, you can do all sorts of neat stuff like set it to only visible in specific views like orthographic, or visible from the back only, front only, etc. Next, I added a couple more circles because this arm is primarily circles, and I grabbed some references of train wheels because I'm thinking of going a kind of realistic direction with this. Then I filled the area between these two circles, and I used bridge to fill the majority of it. The nice thing about working with two circles that are the same number of verts is I was able to just align them and use bridge edge loops to fill between them and get perfect little quads here without having to do much work. And then I'm kind of looking at this connecting arm and thinking it's probably a good idea to add a little bit of extrusion into this because if you look at the train wheels, the arms all have these sort of reinforcing things cast into them. And then I basically just continued using extrusion, duplication, beveling, and all the very basic modeling tools in Blender to just rough out the overall shape of this, checking back periodically to see that I'm relatively aligned to the reference. Now, because we're remaking these and redesigning them a little bit and animating them later, it doesn't have to be perfect, but I wanted to stay relatively faithful to the original proportions because obviously it needs to be identifiable as the Steam logo still. One of the things that I see people doing all the time that I think is maybe not the correct approach to modeling, or at least is not the approach I take, is to try and make everything out of a giant single piece of topology. And I think the better approach, at least for me, is to break everything down into the absolute most basic forms that it could possibly be, and then try and use primitives to start those forms and just add detail passes as needed. And that keeps me from having crazy seams anywhere there's two complex shapes getting joined. Next up, I made this back piece by basically just adding a circle and adding a subdivision modifier to it, and then putting some support loops in to tighten the edges up. And I went ahead and put support loops in and a bevel modifier on my main model as well, just to add a little bit more detail to the edge and to make it so that if I decide to add a subdivision to it later, it's not too much work and the edges still flow nicely. Then I moved on to rigging it. And I basically just added an armature, extruded the armature so that I had two main bones, one small one for this large fat arm and one long skinny one for the longer and skinny arm. And then I added one final one on the edge of the I'm just going to call it control arm over there. And that one is going to serve as a target because we're going to be doing a very simple locked track based rig. Then I went ahead and quickly renamed my bones. So when I go ahead and parent my mesh to them, the vertex groups that I've created, which are just one for the arm and one for the other arm, will automatically attach themselves to the bones because they have the same name. Then I added a simple track 2 constraint, realized that wasn't what I wanted, went back, added a locked track constraint, which if you don't know the difference, the lock track basically does almost the same thing, but it locks one single axis. And because this is a mechanical rig, that's what we want. And then I added that to the arm, tracked it to the target bone that we put in earlier, corrected the roll so that it doesn't behave weirdly, and now we have a working rig. Now I can parent it, and those vertex groups that I mentioned earlier will kick in, and the whole thing should move like a piston. Except it clips through itself. So I have to do a little bit of work to fix that. And all I'm going to do is just move this piece over a little bit, grab the verts, tweak it a little bit, and then I'm just going to play with the rig so that I can kind of check the clearances on this. Because if you look at actual Steam machinery, a lot of the clearances are surprisingly tight, which is kind of scary because it's going really fast. But I'm not a Steam train designer, so I'm going to assume that's right. One more thing, I'm going to duplicate the back face of this and separate it out as a circle, and we're going to use that as an emitter for some steam later in a simulation, which should be exciting and easy.
Foreshadowing is a narrative device in which suggestions or warnings about events to come are dropped or planted.
Then I added another circle and set it to be 6 faces, and I'm going to use that to make a bolt, but before I can do that, I have to flatten the front of this by adding a few more divisions. Then I just extruded it, used Control-Shift-B to bevel the edges, and added a few divisions. Turned that into a circle using the handy Edit Mesh Tools add-on, which is available on the extensions platform for free. Yay, Blender. And I have a simple bolt. And then I'm just going to use Shift D to duplicate this and Shift R to repeat my duplicate and rotate action. And I'm going to use the batch rename tool to rename these to bolt. I highly encourage you to learn about that. It's very useful for renaming large numbers of objects and having them follow specific patterns. Then I'm just going to go throw some UV seams in. Nothing super complicated, just unfolding this and trying to hide the seams as best I can by placing them places where they won't be visible. And then I can get to testing out some of the CC0 material library that I have. For the materials, I wanted to kind of get something close to the original Steam logo, so I used a cast iron backing plate here, which if you look at most Steam machinery, a lot of it's like heavy machined or cast iron. And then I tried to create some contrast for the light front logo by using a lighter colored metal. And then I started adding in some lighting. I'm just using basic point lights, and I did eventually put in a HDRI to add a little bit of reflection and a little bit more interesting stuff to the metal material. But it is overall a pretty basic lighting setup. But you know what? There's nothing wrong with that. I've actually found that the simplest lighting setups are often the ones that give you the best results, because the more lights you introduce, the more room there is to just kind of make things complicated and add areas where things just don't quite look right and you don't actually know which light the issue is coming from. The next thing I did was start creating the app background, and I basically wanted that to just be a simple, rounded, and beveled rectangle. So I just created a square and did a little bit of basic beveling on it, and voila. And then I duplicated a piece of that, and I'm going to basically invert it by deleting just the faces and leaving the edges, and then extruding those edges outward. And that I'm going to use as a mask. Now, I already have this handy mask folder set up, and if you see the little icon on the side there, that's what's called a holdout. And a holdout basically just allows you to use any geometry in that collection as a mask to mask parts of the image that you don't want to render visible. And if you see with my transparent mesh here, it's hiding the arm. And my reasoning for that is simple. I don't want that arm to be visible outside of the app icon. The next thing I did was move over to working in EmberGen, because at the end of this, I want there to be a little puff of steam coming out of the app. And it turned out that was not nearly as easy as I thought it was, and that's mostly my own fault.
Foreshadowing as a narrative device.
I'm not going to lie, guys. I've been at this for probably 3 or 4 hours. It's like 9:30 at night. This video goes out in a couple days. This part is not quite as easy as I was expecting it to be. And getting there, but I just want you to remember that when you're doing something, just because you assume a project is going to be easy and straightforward doesn't mean it always will be. And I'm finding that out yet again. I did eventually wrap it up though, and here's the final result. Next, I had to decide which logo I wanted to make next. And it's kind of hard because there's a lot of cool choices here. System settings logo would be cool, but I actually ended up opting for the Davinci Resolve logo. So maybe look for the system settings one in another video if this is popular. And the reason I picked Davinci Resolve is it's a program I've been using more and more lately because I'm trying to break my reliance on Adobe and get out from their evil clutches. So the nice thing about having the other one done is I could start with the app background that I already had. And I did, and I just added an inset cut, added a basic black material for the app background, and then a basic light emitter material to that cut that I made to kind of simulate the same outline thing that the logo had going on around the edges. And I'll come back to this later, but I wanted that as a start point. I mostly have used Resolve in the past for color correction, so I immediately associate it with color grading and everything color related. And I wanted to create an effect that was like droplets of colored ink moving back and forth through each other. To do that, I tried a few different things, but ultimately I landed on moving a sphere through a lattice. And the cool thing about lattices are you can parent an object to them and then use them to non-destructively deform that object either by deforming the lattice using shape keys or by passing the object through the lattice. And what I'm doing with the sphere here is the second one. I'm taking the sphere, I'm keeping the lattice in place, and I'm just going to ping pong the sphere back and forth through the lattice so that it smushes down like a drop of liquid and then smushes back up. And that way, it can be the same shape both at the top and bottom of the animation, and I have a lot of control over what that shape is. And you can see here that it worked. With my lattice setup, I was able to set keyframes for my sphere and have it move back and forth up and down through the lattice, smushing in the center and returning to the correct shape at the top and bottom. And I just set up the first half of the animation and then copied and pasted the end keys so that the positions will be exactly the same for the start and end. And then I just duplicated the whole thing and rotated it to match the shape of my reference. Before I did that rotation, though, I had to do a little bit of fiddling with the lattice. So while I fiddle with the lattice, let me kind of let you in on what I was thinking about the color. If you look carefully at the logo, you can see that the colors chosen aren't random. It's actually sections of an RGB color wheel, as if the logo shape has been overlaid over one. So to achieve that, I wanted to emit light from it and use a RGB color wheel texture, which is exactly what I did. But to keep the logo colors the same, even though the objects are moving, I was going to have to use a UV projection method other than UVs. After trying a few different ones, ultimately what I landed on was window, because with the color texture's coordinates relative to the camera window, the colors would stay in the same position while the objects move, which is exactly the effect that I was looking for. And with that done, I started messing with the shader brightness, but this is where things got kind of tricky for this one.
Foreshadowing is
No matter what I did to the brightness or the color settings, something wasn't quite right. Either it was too dim, or if it was too bright, it was too desaturated. And no matter what color profile I used, I just couldn't get it to something that I liked. But that's the great thing about working in 3D. You are working in 3 dimensions. So I had an idea, and I decided to kind of break from what I had planned and try something new. So I duplicated the entire thing, moved it behind the original, and then started messing with the shading for the front. Once I got the front one to something that I was relatively happy with, I could start messing with the back one. By creating that second logo in the back and brightening it, I can now use it as a line, effectively, around the outside of the front one, since it's being blocked by the front one unless I scale it up slightly. And the more I increase the scale, the thicker this glowing line around the logo gets. And it's a much more interesting and dynamic look for the logo, I think. But there's another problem. The problem is the visual weight of the logo is much heavier where there's 2 prongs on one side than when there's one. That's not an issue for Resolve because their logo doesn't move, but mine does, so I need to find a solution. And what I landed on was animating the background to match the visual weight. So I just set a keyframe for the background, played the logo animation forward, set another keyframe, and then copied the original keyframe so it returns to the exact same spot. Now, is it perfect? No, but it stays pretty close to the center. But now I have a logo and background that move up and down. So how do I solve that? Actually, this one's easy. I parent the camera to the moving background. Now the entire thing will move as a unit, and functionally, it will be still. With that wrapped up, I started in on messing around with the app icon a little bit because I wasn't totally happy with the way the border looked and some of the proportions, so I ended up just deleting that. I tried chamfering it first and it didn't really work, and instead I just made the border thinner. Then I decided I wasn't totally happy with the shape of the teardrops. They looked a little bit too angular to me. And rather than correct all of them, I opted to actually delete the bottom 2 and instead just keep the upper one. And I adjusted it until I was happy with it, and then I created collection instances of those 2 and just duplicated those. That way, if I have to make further adjustments to the lattices or the animation timing, I'm only adjusting 2 instead of 6. Then it was time to tackle lighting. So I went into my very handy Polyhaven library of HDRs, and I started adding some high contrast studio ones to get a little bit of nice outlining on the icon since I made it relatively reflective. Then I just threw in a basic spot lamp, diffused it a little bit by changing the size, turned it slightly blue, and just off-centered it ever so slightly and tried to kind of replicate the look of the icon that I'm using as reference. Finally, I decided it would be better for the border to be a rainbow color rather than just plain white, so I UV'd it and I added the rainbow texture to it in the emissive, and I just changed the UVs to be that simple square so that it would wrap the entire rainbow around the border as well. And then I went and started messing around with the animation. and retiming it to get something that would work for the final animation, since a perfect loop isn't going to work because we want it to animate in when we click it. And so that has to have a finite start point and a finite stop point. So with the animation set up to only cycle a couple times, the last piece of the puzzle was the border. And I decided to have this turn on as the last part of the cycle hit. So the droplets would pass through each other a couple times, and then the border would brighten and turn into that cool rainbow color. And I did that by just moving to a couple frames before the animation ends and setting the emission value keyframe to 0, and then moving a few frames ahead to the end of the full animation and setting it to 100. And here's how the animation looks on the dock. And for my last logo, you know I had to pick the Blender logo, because it wouldn't be a 3D YouTube tutorial if I didn't mention Blender. Otherwise, it would just be sparkling computer graphics. I'm not really sure where I was going with that. You know the deal with this one. We're going to reuse that same app background so everything is a nice consistent size, and we're going to bring in a background reference image just so we have something to work from. And I'm going to take a similar modeling approach to the Steam logo, but first I'm going to just add a simple metal surface to this, and I'm just going to turn it black a little bit, take the metallic out of it, and look at that. We're already really, really close to how the app background looks. So making lots of progress on this one quickly. And similar to the Steam thing, as I mentioned, I'm going to just start with a circle, and then I'm going to make these little, I don't know what these are, hair? I don't actually know what the Blender logo is. Does anyone know what the Blender logo actually is? If you do, tell me what it is in the comments, because I have no idea, and I've been using this program for like a decade. Anyway, I'm going to extrude those out. I'm just going to kind of roughly match them to the shape of these things. And then I'm going to take these divisions out so I don't have to deal with them, and just push it over the edge here, and then use Control-Shift-B to bevel those edge pieces once I've got this scaled to fit. And that way I can just kind of round it off without having to think about it too much or do much work. And I'm going to follow the exact same approach for the other. Are they hair? I really don't know what they are. Anyway, I'm going to follow the same approach for these other little things. And with those in place, then I'm going to start working on the center. With that all taken care of, I'm just going to inset this central face, and I'm going to use the Edit Mesh Tools add-on, which is something I recommend everybody install when they first start Blender. It's free, it's on the extensions platform, to transform that into a perfect circle. And then I'm just going to warp it slightly so that it fits this center piece, which I've always kind of thought of as an eye. And it's just kind of now occurring to me that I kind of think of the Blender logo as a little guy. I don't know if that's what it is. I should have asked Ton when I was at Blender conference what it actually is, but it didn't occur to me at the time. Anyway, with that all wrapped up, I'm going to just add some beveling to the outside to make it a little bit more interesting. Then I'm going to go into the topology and just add some divisions here so that I can make the mesh a relatively even set of quads. And that's going to help us get nice deformation with the rig we're going to build. And to do that, I'm just going to add an armature and extrude out 3 bones. And then I'm going to extrude 3 more bones for the, I'm just going to call it hair, and you'll see why in a second. And once those are in place, I'm going to select those bones and subdivide them so we have a bunch more bones. And then I'm just going to select my armature and select my object and parent the object to the armature with automatic weights. And then with the armature selected, I'm going to enable Bone Dynamics Pro on it, which is an add-on I paid for because I use it all the time and it's super, super useful. And you can see here, what it does is it basically adds some basic jiggle physics to your bones. And if you're going to do something like anything basically that has animation in it, I highly recommend this add-on because it's super, super useful for adding some little basic dynamics, whether you have panels moving around or, in my case, turning the Blender logo into weird wobbly hair. Anyway, I'll leave a link for that add-on in the description because I love it and I use it all the time. With the rigging all taken care of, I moved into making some very basic materials, and I just created an orange, a blue, and a white, and I went on to the Blender branding information part of their website, and I grabbed the hex codes for Blender orange, Blender blue, and white is just white. So I went ahead and added those into the Blender logo, and I messed around with the roughness and metallic a little bit, but I ended up just having it be a semi-rough basic PBR material, and that was it. That's all it really took. And then I threw a little bit of HDR lighting in and another couple basic lights to give the logo a little bit of dynamic lighting, and I was pretty happy with that. So it was time to start animation. To animate this, I took an approach that I'm very fond of, which is work smarter, not harder. So I wanted to just start the app icon part at 0 scale and just have it sort of do a little bounce as it came back up. And for that, all I needed was 2 keyframes and to change the key interpolation to bounce mode. Or actually, I think I used back for this one. And then for the logo jumping, I wanted to have it use bounce mode. And I mentioned this a couple times, but I've always thought of the Blender logo as kind of a silly little guy. And I also think of the Blender logo a little bit in the same frame of reference that I use for the Nickelodeon logo, weirdly, because they're kind of similar colors, I guess. And so for the animation, I just did a very basic jump and fall animation, and I used the bounce interpolation mode so that when the logo lands, it would bounce. On its own, that would be kind of boring. But with the rigging we had in, those little hair thingies, I still don't know what they are, tentacles, whatever, bounce around in a really funny and kind of silly way. But Blender is an animation program, and ultimately, a logo should be a reflection of what the program does. And so for Resolve, we picked color. For Steam, we picked literally Steam. And I think it makes sense and is sort of fitting that the Blender logo be animation. And again, I'll say, using keyframe interpolation and very basic messing with the graph editor is a much better approach than trying to key every single small move. You can get a lot more done with the graph editor, and you don't run the risk of messing up your keyframes and making them super overly complicated. For this, all I was doing for retiming is just tweaking the position of 3 or 4 keyframes until I was really happy with the overall look of the animation. And eventually, I got to something I was happy with. And here's what that one looks like on the dock. Do you have an idea of what logo I should do next? Comment it below, or join my Discord and tell me there. And because it's the end of the video, this is the part where I remind you to never stop learning.